Hey everybody, what's going on? I am Greg Sussman, joined today by our own Frank Stample, who's going to help us fill out the waiver wire as we look toward Week 6. What's happening, Frankie?
Week 5 was awesome, Greggy, and today, if you think players on bad teams do not have fantasy value, we're going to try to debunk that theory.
Oh, we're going to do the best we can because almost all the players we're talking about today, teams don't have many wins. And by many, you mean any. You'll see in just a matter of moments. Let's begin at the quarterback position. Frank, we had a couple of buys, of course, this week. So if you're losing your quarterback to a bye or an injury, in the case of Mason Rudolph, who's a quarterback that you can replace him with?
We're looking at the Minshew mustache. This guy has a cult following right now in the NFL and amongst Jaguars fans, and rightfully so. He has performed really well so far this season. He's thrown multiple touchdowns in 4 of 5 games, completing 67% of his passes so far this season, and he's had some volume as well. I know typically we look at the Jacksonville Jaguars as a team that wants to run the football on the back of Leonard Fournette, but ultimately, Gardner Minshew has 30 pass attempts, at least 30 pass attempts in 4 straight games. He also makes plays with his legs. He's averaging 25 rushing yards per game. He's going up against the New Orleans Saints in Week 6 as well. So we could see some points back and forth here. Ultimately, the Saints defense has allowed the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks so far this season. The Jaguars defense is not playing nearly as well without Jalen Ramsey. So if Teddy Bridgewater and Alvin Kamara could put up points again this week, then we can see ultimately some points going back and forth between Minshew and the New Orleans Saints. And a fun fact here, this comes courtesy of Field Yates. There's only 3 quarterbacks with at least 16-plus fantasy points in every game so far this season. Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, and you guessed it, Gardner Minshew. I like the matchup. We're rolling with him, Greg.
I like him too, man. Gardner Minshew's been really good. You heard the stats that Field Yates gave out that Frank relayed to you. Minshew's been solid from a fantasy perspective. Can't do better than solid, babe. Gardner Minshew, a solid addition this week if you're looking for a quarterback. Another solid addition that you can potentially make is Kirk Cousins because clearly Adam Thielen called out his quarterback, and it worked. Thielen had a monster game against the Giants, as did Cousins. Can they keep it rolling this week, Frankie?
Yeah, they should be able to. Going up against the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 6, we saw Kirk Cousins last week against the Giants throw for over 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. The squeaky wheel got the oil when it came to Adam Thielen, but ultimately, this is a really good matchup going up against this Eagles secondary outside of Luke Falk, because Luke Falk and the Jets are god-awful. They are terrible. The Eagles were allowing 331 passing yards per game to opposing quarterbacks, 9 total passing touchdowns, and the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks so far this season. So I like the matchup for Kirk Cousins and the Vikings pass attack going up against a secondary that is beat up. We have to pay attention to this Eagles secondary because Ronald Darby has been out. Avonte Maddox missed this past week as well. And the Eagles defense is really good at stopping the run. So are the Vikings going to be able to run the ball effectively with Dalvin Cook? It remains to be seen, but this is exactly what Adam Thielen was talking about after that loss to the Chicago Bears, where you can't just be one-dimensional. If you're going up against a team that has a really good run defense, you have to try to attack them through the air. So ultimately, the Eagles are allowing just 2.81 yards per carry to opposing running backs. I don't think that the Vikings are going to have the same success as they have all season running the ball with Dalvin Cook, which means they're probably going to have to air it out, which means we like Kirk Cousins once again in Week 6 going up against the Eagles.
This week against the Giants, Cousins got it working with Adam Thielen. Maybe next week against the Eagles and that leaky secondary, he'll be able to do the same for Stephon Diggs. Cousins, a fine play and pickup this Sunday. Moving on from the quarterbacks to the running backs. Listen, it's not a great waiver wire week. Just like last week wasn't a great waiver wire week. But if you're desperate, you may want to look to Washington and specifically Adrian Peterson. We get it. He doesn't really run very well anymore. But when you're facing the Miami Dolphins, well, they can make anybody look like their older selves. And with Jay Gruden being dismissed earlier on Monday, they promoted Bill Callahan, who said, we got to establish the run, baby. That adds up to a whole lot of Adrian Peterson.
Yeah, Greg, this is where the fun begins. The fun begins when it comes to Adrian Peterson going up against the Miami Dolphins. You mentioned it's not a great waiver wire week in terms of running backs. We didn't really have any big injuries. Make sure you pay attention to David Johnson. He's dealing with a back injury, so Chase Edmonds could come into play. But ultimately, we're going to look at matchups then. And this is a good matchup for Adrian Peterson going up against the Miami Dolphins. They have allowed 9 total touchdowns to running backs so far this season. And guess what? They've played 1 less game than everyone else. They're coming off of a bye week as well. They're allowing 4.77 yards per carry to opposing running backs. That's the 7th most in the league. And Greg, you mentioned that Bill Callahan is now taking over as the interim head coach of the Washington Redskins. He has experience as a head coach, as an offensive coordinator, but he's really been known for being an offensive line coach, and he wants to run the football. You mentioned that as well. You alluded to that. Washington, 3.5-point favorites on the road going up against the Miami Dolphins, and it makes sense that they would want to establish the run. I mean, their quarterbacks are Colt McCoy, Case Keenum, Dwayne Haskins, so I think we get a fair amount of Adrian Peterson in this matchup, likely looking at 15-plus carries, and it is a really, really good one going up against the Miami Dolphins.
It's an awesome one against the Miami Dolphins. And hey, when Washington's going to be in the game with a new coach, they want to really make their mark on it. And that means they're going to rely on what they know. Bill Callahan is the offensive line coach. He wants his hog mollies to create room for AP. And that's exactly what's going to happen on Sunday. But Frankie, that's not the only running back we're taking in this game. Because let's go over to the other side. As bad as Miami is, Washington's seemingly just as terrible, which means Kenyan Drake is a viable play coming out of the bye for Miami.
Yeah, I just want to apologize to everyone first and foremost for recommending 2 running backs in this game. The Miami Dolphins going up against the Washington Redskins. But ultimately, there are 2 teams that are not great. They are winless teams. We could see some running on both sides. They don't have great quarterback play between Washington's triumvirate and the Miami Dolphins' Josh Rosen. But ultimately, Kenyan Drake on a bad team is still a bright spot. I do believe that he is a talented player. And playing 57% of the snaps for the Miami Dolphins so far this season, Kalen Ballage is terrible. He is not a good player. If you saw the highlights, the highlights, again, of Kalen Ballage the past couple of weeks, when passes are being thrown to him, he is ducking out of the way. He doesn't even want to be on the football field. So why is he on the football field? Well, that's where Kenyan Drake comes in the mix. Kalen Ballage averaging under 2 yards per carry. It's not a good offensive line. I understand that. But Washington just allowed 237 total yards, 10 receptions, and 2 total touchdowns to Patriots running backs in Week 5. Yes, I understand the Miami Dolphins are not the Patriots, but that reminds us that this Washington defense is not very good, and Kenyan Drake is talented. He's seeing more snaps. He's seeing more work. He's seeing, about 15% of the target share for the Dolphins so far this year. So even if they fall behind, he should see some targets and receptions out of the backfield. It's a good matchup going up against Washington.
It's a great matchup going against Washington. Kenyan Drake, he's going to catch those passes out of the backfield, as Frankie mentioned, and hopefully he can find his way into the end zone. If the Dolphins don't turn the ball over, including Drake, it could be a chance for them to get their first win. And much of that will be thanks to what Kenyan Drake does. Decidingly, he could be a big pickup for you this week off the waiver wire. Let's move on to the wide receivers, Frank. We're not going too far. We're staying in Miami because you're a huge Dolphins fan now.
Yeah, I figured I would just switch my allegiance, inside of the division. I was a Jets fan, but now we'll move over to the Miami Dolphins. What do I have to lose? But realistically, look, Devante Parker is coming off a game where he looked pretty good. He had 4 receptions for 70 yards and a touchdown right before the bye in Week 4 with Josh Rosen as his quarterback. And he's accounted for 18% of the target share so far this season for the Miami Dolphins, 35% of the Dolphins' air yards. So he's seeing a ton of passes down the field, evidenced by his average depth of target, which is 20.3, playing 87% of the snaps on the year as well. Devante Parker, a former first-round pick, he's finally getting an opportunity to play, frankly, because the Dolphins just don't have a lot of talent on the field. I'll throw Preston Williams in this mix as well if you're in a deeper league. I do prefer Devante Parker over him as well, but it's a good matchup. Again, going up against Washington, the defense overall for Washington hasn't been good, but the biggest flaw to their defense has actually been their secondary. Josh Norman is not the player that he once was. They're allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers this season. They just got torched by Julian Edelman, allowed him to go over 100 yards and a touchdown. The week before that, they allowed Taylor Gabriel, yes, Taylor Gabriel, to score 3 touchdowns through the air with Mitchell Trubisky as his quarterback, which proves that, even the worst quarterbacks can perform against this Washington secondary. So I'm looking at Devante Parker, again, in a good matchup going up against Washington.
I feel like every week, Frank, you wanted to give out either Preston Williams or Devante Parker, and I usually don't let you do that. But this week, the waiver wire is so bare that it is what it is. Miami receivers, get them in there. Good luck. All right, moving on from Miami, but to another wide receiver. Auden Tate, somebody that Jim Sanas and I talked about last week, and for a good reason. This team lost John Ross, and Auden Tate was facing off against the Cardinals, much like Tyler Eifert. It didn't work out for Eifert. it did work out for Tate, who scored a late touchdown for Cincinnati. Can Tate keep it going this week, Frankie?
Yeah, I think he can keep it going this week, and I think he can actually keep it going for most of the regular season here as well for Cincinnati. I'll get to that in a little bit. He had modest production in Week 5. He was saved by a late touchdown, only had 3 catches. He was held under 30 yards. The touchdown obviously helped. Going up against the Baltimore Ravens in Week 6, and the Baltimore Ravens are an 11.5-point favorite. So, Vegas is expecting the Cincinnati Bengals to be playing from behind in this matchup, which means they're likely going to have to throw. And over the past couple of weeks, we've seen that Auden Tate's target share has gone up. Over the past 3 weeks, 20% target share, at least 6 targets in each of those games. 27% of the air yards as well, so he's seeing targets down the field, and he's a big body. He's like 6'4", 6'5", seeing targets in the red zone as well, as we saw in Week 5, scoring that late touchdown ultimately. And look, the Baltimore Ravens defense, their secondary hasn't been as good recently. They're banged up. Tony Jefferson is now out for the season for the Baltimore Ravens defense as well. And when we look at the longevity of the season for the Cincinnati Bengals, I don't think that A.J. Green plays another game with this team. He's in a contract year. He's entering free agency. He's a little bit older now. Why is he going to risk getting back on the field for a winless Cincinnati Bengals team? I'm looking at Auden Tate, that someone that can actually have value this week against Baltimore because they are big underdogs and that secondary is banged up. But I actually think Auden Tate is someone that has value for the rest of the season as well, Greg.
Auden Tate's been very involved in the Cincinnati Bengals offense, and the opponent hasn't exactly mattered. Make sure you rely on Tate here, who has now gotten Andy Dalton's favor. You like Tate with A.J. Green and John Ross seemingly not coming back anytime soon. Moving on from the wide receivers, we get to the tight ends, and I think this is probably the most plentiful position on the waiver wire this weekend. We got 2 good choices for you. We'll begin on another terrible team. It's the New York Jets. They're getting, hopefully, Sam Darnold back. That's the maybe. But they're definitely getting back Chris Herndon, whose 4-game suspension is finally over. Herndon was a popular sleeper candidate coming into this season. Now we'll see what he gets to do when the Jets offense gets their quarterback back. We hope.
Yes, indeed, Greg. We hope when it comes to Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold is not, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, but he has to be better than Luke Falk and David Fales, which means that he will help all the weapons in the Jets offense come back to viability when it comes to fantasy. Jamison Crowder, Robbie Anderson, Le'Veon Bell, and now Chris Herndon entering the mix as well, coming off a 4-game suspension. I understand it's Week 6. The math doesn't necessarily add up, but if you remember, the Jets had a bye in Week 4, so now Chris Herndon is eligible to return for this team, and he was pretty good last year. He was tight end 15 overall last season as a rookie. You don't normally see that type of production out of a rookie tight end, but some underlying impressive analytical numbers as well. 12.9 yards per carry. That was 9th among tight ends last year. 9 yards per target. That was 7th among tight ends last year. And Chris Herndon had only 1 drop all of last season. And we saw towards the end of last season, Sam Darnold started to take that next step. He had a big final month of the year, and Chris Herndon and him kind of showed off a little bit of that rapport. This defense hasn't shown up for the New York Jets so far this year. They're likely playing from behind in a lot of games, which means they'll be throwing the ball, which means that Chris Herndon should be involved. And while we're talking about the tight end of the Jets, Ryan Griffin has been the tight end so far this year and has ran a ton of routes. So I think that Chris Herndon is going to be on the field a lot. This is a Jets team that is starved for talent, Greg.
They need playmakers, man. It all starts at the quarterback spot where Luke Falk is just not an NFL starting quarterback. Hopefully, as I keep saying, Sam Darnold's back. And getting another weapon like Chris Herndon, who is talented and athletic and can do damage down the field, it will be a huge boon to Adam Gaze's offense. If Herndon is out there, it's well worth a speculative pickup. But Frank, forget about speculation. We don't need that when it comes to Gerald Everett, who over the last 2 weeks has really proven that he is a major part of Sean McVay's offense. Brandon Cooks may miss this week with a concussion, which means Everett moves up in the pecking order. Sure, you still have to deal with Tyler Higbee, but Gerald Everett has certainly made his mark.
Yeah, he has made his mark, Greg. And if you remember way back on Thursday Night Football against the Seattle Seahawks, Gerald Everett had a monster game. 7 catches, 136 yards on 11 targets. You brought up Tyler Higbee. He's kind of being phased out of the offense right now. Even with Tyler Higbee back last week against the Seattle Seahawks, Gerald Everett played 81% of the snaps and ran 37 routes compared to Tyler Higbee's 14. Over the past 2 weeks specifically, Gerald Everett has been more of a part of the offense. It seems like Sean McVay really wants to get Gerald Everett involved. During that time, he has 19 targets. He's finished as the tight end 5 and the tight end 1, respectively, in each of the past 2 matchups. And you mentioned that Brandon Cooks is banged up, dealing with a concussion as well. So there could be even more targets to go around for Gerald Everett. If you remember, when Everett was coming out of college, it was actually Sean McVay who drafted Gerald Everett, and we all thought that, Everett was going to be a thing because Sean McVay came over from Washington, where Jordan Reed was used heavily in the offense there. Well, maybe, it took a couple of years. A lot of the times we see these younger tight ends, they take some time to become acclimated to the NFL, and it seems like Gerald Everett is finally coming around. So you're right, Greg. It's not speculation. The production is actually happening right now when it comes to Gerald Everett.
The breakout is real with Gerald Everett. This offense always real with the Los Angeles Rams. You always want a part of good offenses like the Rams, like the Chiefs. Gerald Everett, a cheap way to do so. Everett's out there in a lot of leagues, so grab him. Before we wrap up, Frank, why don't you give us a streaming defense that's worth picking up and starting here on Sunday?
Well, we'll go back to my Jets, Jets. That's the Dallas Cowboys are facing the Jets in Week 6, traveling to MetLife Stadium. Maybe they'll get Sam Darnold. Maybe they'll get Luke Falk. Who knows at this point? But regardless, what we do know is that this offense is broken right now. The offensive line is not good. Kelechi Osemele did not play this past week. He's dealing with an injury. They started a rookie, Chuma Edoga, at right tackle. Yes, that is correct. They allowed 10 total sacks this past week. Going up against the Philadelphia Eagles, they allowed 2 defensive touchdowns as well. Even if Sam Darnold is back, I do expect him to have to shake off some rust. They'll probably be playing from behind, which means that Sam Darnold's going to have to drop back a ton, which means that there's opportunity for sacks, turnovers, fumbles, interceptions, whatever it might be. And this Cowboys defense is actually allowing just 321 total yards per game. That's 6th best in the league. I like the Cowboys in this spot going up against the Jets, Greg.
The Cowboys were dropped off your waiver wire. If the Cowboys were dropped on your waiver wire, go pick them up. Facing the Jets. Can't ignore that. That's going to do it for us here on the FanDuel Hurry Up. Frank, don't spend too much money on Chris Herndon this week, bud.
Yeah, I'll try not to. I love those Jets, Greg. Good luck to everybody out there, and don't be scared to pick up players on bad teams.
And teams score also. Just not as much as the good teams, but they do score. Hopefully it'll be the players we suggested. Have a great night, everybody. I'll be back tomorrow with JJ Zachariason, as we'll tell you who we're buying and selling.